Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you again for attending the SOC 2 Compliance Program webinar here. We're going to get started. My name is Gaydosh. I'm Director of Security Intelligence. Also, Hong Lee, our Security Intelligence Advisor here at Anitian. What we're going to do today is just share with you some of the common challenges we've seen our clients face in building and maintaining a SOC 2 compliance program and some of our recommended strategies for dealing with those challenges. So, as I said, I'm the Director of Security Intelligence at Anitian, so I oversee our consulting practices, as well as doing quite a bit of compliance work. And with me on this presentation, who will be leading the content is Hong Lee.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks for attending this webinar. My name is Hong Lee. I work for Anitian. Just real quickly about myself. Security Intelligence Advisor. I work directly for Adam. I'm currently responsible for implementing a set of controls for a client for an upcoming audit, specifically SOC 2. Prior to that, I've taken another company from essentially nothing to ISO compliant, certified. And prior to that, I spent about 11 years in the Army, essentially working on their information assurance program with multiple units as I travel between duty stations.
Thank you, Hong. So what we have here is just a basic overview of Anitian's vision and mission statements here, and that we do believe security is essential to growth, innovation, and prosperity, and are proud of our role in enabling that from an information security perspective by our advisory practices and our managed cloud security practice, which we'll talk about in a moment, building great security programs and practices. And we're honored to have worked with some really world-class organizations and look forward to many more. Okay, so what we have here is a listing of the 5 core practices we have at Anitian. Just a very brief overview. Risk Now is our risk assessment practice. We execute risk assessments from a variety of perspectives, be it compliance or best practices, as well as third-party risk assessments on behalf of our clients for their business partners, and also help our clients build out risk management programs. Vision Path is our compliance practice. That's where we do the bulk of our SOC 2 work, as well as many other security standards that we are proficient in, such as being a PCI DSS qualified security assessor company. Ring Zero is our security testing practices, where we do all of our technical testing, pen testing, web app testing. Social engineering is always fun, of course, and a variety of other technical OPSEC type of works there. Sherlock is our managed cloud security practice. So the core offering is managed detection and response. It's a cloud-based security operations center that we run on behalf of our clients. And finally, we have vCISO, which is our security advisory governance, CISO as a service practice. Okay, so let me just give you a brief overview of our intent today before I turn it over to Hong to outline the presentation and dive right in. So what we're really focused on today is to provide you a basic overview of what is required to build out a SOC 2 compliance program. So this is not going to be necessarily SOC 2 101. Hong will touch on that in the assumptions. We will, of course, highlight the absolute basics, but really this is more about what we've learned in the trenches working with our clients to identify the common challenges, pitfalls, points of confusion, frequently asked questions, and the strategies that we found to be most effective in overcoming those obstacles in order to actually build out a compliance program, successfully get through audit, and then maintain operational effectiveness of that program. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Hong.
Thank you, Adam. So like Adam said, the intent of this presentation, it's not necessarily a SOC 2 101 presentation. I'm happy to answer those questions should there be time towards the end. But then it's really just to share with you guys what we've come across, some of the key takeaways of this presentation, and what to look for, what challenges to look for as you pursue your SOC 2 program. In front of you, you're going to have assumptions, determine the scopes, selecting the trusted service principles, which is really key, and I'll go into more detail later on. And also overcoming some challenge, both from what I've seen and from what my peers have seen while we engage during our engagement with a few of our clients. And also recommending an approach to the trusted service principle, or what's now called the trusted service criteria. So that's the presentation today, and we'll just move on. Okay, so to start off, some of my assumptions of you. So to start, I'm assuming you're familiar with just SOC 2 in general. What is meant by type 1? What is meant by type 2? What is a SOC 2 compliance audit? Also, my assumption is you know the difference between a SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3 compliance report. But if not, I'll just go briefly over. SOC 1 is essentially your financial compliance audit. SOC 2 is a compliance audit, more non-financial, and it's more geared towards your SaaS-based company. And SOC 3 is essentially like a SOC 2, but leaving out all the details, specifically all the what's been tested and details of the SOC 2 report. And SOC 3 is normally more public for organizations who want to share it out to their clients. And lastly, what is meant by operational effectiveness. It's really a compliance thing over time. And like I said, if there's time towards the end, I'll go into that more in detail. Okay, so before you start a SOC 2 program or while you're engaged in a SOC 2 program, the very first question or the key things you need to, what we've learned with our clients is you really need to understand what service offerings you want certified. That really ties into the next key point there is what's the driver behind that service offering? Is it a potential addressable market you want to get into? Is it customers now asking for it or potential customers? Or is it maybe you're a vendor to another business partner and now that business partner requires it from you? And the reason why it's key is because once you select that service offering, you're going to have to really look at your system scope. And in system scope defined by AICPA, it's very detailed. It's very kind of black and white, listed in front of you. Infrastructure, software, people, processes, data, boundaries. Boundaries is really key for SaaS companies because as you come time to audit your service offering or your product and it's in the cloud, and that's where it gets tricky. Also, third parties. You want to let your third party know that you are pursuing a SOC 2 compliance report if your product relies on it. Because it serves two purposes. One, if they have a SOC 2 report themselves, it makes your work a lot easier. And two, they're not blindsided, right? When you come time to ask for one, and they have it ready to go. Okay. So after you decided which service offering or offerings you want to be compliant, really the next step is selecting the appropriate trusted service principles. So according to the AICPA manual, the trusted service principles are broken down to 5 principles, and each of them consists of their own criteria. Biggest takeaway from this, as we were working with our clients, is you do not have to comply with all 5 TSPs right off the bat. What we advise is only pursue the TSP that closely aligns with your service offerings and just start there. Okay, it makes it a lot easier to develop your controls, develop your test activities, and it gives you just less work, essentially. One takeaway too is at a minimum, you have to comply with the security principles, which is essentially what's called the common criteria. So the common criteria is just a set of criteria that applies to all service principles, whether you pursue security and availability or security and confidentiality. It applies to all of them. And since you're pursuing the common criteria, you pretty much are pursuing the security principle. The recommendation from our end is essentially you want to pursue at least 2, security and availability. But like I said, you don't have to comply with all 5 TSP. That's just our recommendation. And lastly, in some cases, what we've learned and what we advise to some of our clients is in some cases within that criteria for the TSP, that criteria may not apply to your service offering or product. I'll give you an example. If your product doesn't do anything with financial data or financial information, but a criteria calls it out within the common criteria, you can essentially just omit that. And that's a management decision. You just log it, and then you'd want to bring that up to your auditor or what's called practitioner in the AICPA manual.
So the way I think of this, I know a lot of folks I work with find the terminology within SOC 2 to be a little confusing. The TSPs are effectively control families in more common kind of audit speak, if you will. And so these are the categories of controls, and they have the criteria or the requirements within them. So security is the baseline, and then from there you would select which others would be most appropriate for what you're trying to achieve. Again, we're not going to get into SOC 2 101. Hong actually wrote a great blog about that you can find on our Anitian blog website that touches on this a little bit more. But just the way you want to think about when you're scoping this is what is your intended outcome of a SOC 2 audit. Generally, this is some type of, it's obviously a service provider of some sort, hence the name. That used to be called service organization controls. Now they've changed the terminology with the most recent version, system and organization controls, but nevertheless does apply to service organization. So you want to think of the people that are using our service, what assurance are we trying to provide them? So you might be a SaaS provider, and the main concern is with security, but not necessarily available because it may not be availability because it may not be mission critical. So you might just use the security one, which is the baseline, what used to be the common criteria. Or you might be a data center provider, in which case availability is incredibly important. So you would include that as well. So again, it's really when you're selecting your controls, the TSPs, the control families, it's really about thinking what your customers are going to expect out of your SOC 2 compliance attestation. And really the whole point of having a SOC 2 report that you can share is to provide that assurance to your business partners and your existing customers and your future customers. So there's been a big shift in third-party risk management and people becoming much more aware of the risk exposure their organization has based on dependencies of their business partners and vendors. That's what we've seen as the real driver for why more people are asking their business partners and vendors to have SOC 2 compliance reports to provide that assurance. Okay.
Okay, so next few slides, I just want to share with you some of the challenges that I've seen and that we've come across while working with our clients. The first one being, and this specifically ties to the latest 2017 TSP, is that some of the criteria you come across are very vague. as you reach a criteria and you're trying to develop your controls to meet that criteria, it's open to interpretation. It was designed that way to give the organization the ability to come up with the controls they can to meet that criteria. And the problem with that is it left that criteria open to interpretation. For example, one criteria may say, what is your something along the line of precision? And we're like, well, what does that really mean? So how did we overcome that? First thing is, bringing in an SME or someone who's done SOC 2 in the past, like myself or a peer. And also, if possible, bring in an auditor or an audit firm that you intend to use to audit your SOC 2 report. And this gives you two benefits. One, it gives them the opportunity to really understand your business and your service offering and what you're trying to achieve. As you're going through the criteria and interpreting them and designing your controls, the SME and or the auditor is there on site to guide you through those control development or create them themselves. The next one is the auditor or the SME may assist in reducing the number of controls needed to meet those criteria. For example, you may come up with 72 controls or control activities to meet the security criteria or common criteria. And we may come in, or the auditor may come in and rewrite it in a way that now instead of 72 controls, you're down to 60, which makes it a lot easier to implement.
And don't be afraid to reach out to your audit firm and have them review the control definitions that you have created to map to the criteria. It's a very common practice, and it really is important to establish a good communication cadence with your audit firm to ensure that your interpretation is aligned with theirs.
Yes.
Now, as Hong was talking about, they use the term criteria rather than requirements or control because it's up to you, and as he said, by design, to have the ability to interpret what is the appropriate control implementation for given criteria. But obviously, you need to make sure that aligns with what your auditor's interpretation of appropriateness is as well. So it's a very important step to work with them in advance of implementation, or certainly at least in advance of the audit, to vet that your definition of the controls map to the criteria appropriately aligns with their interpretation.
That's a great point, Adam. And like I said, the takeaway here is the auditors will tell you if you're in line, if you're on the right track. They just cannot tell you how to implement those controls, and they can tell you yes or no. They just cannot do the how, which is the reason why we've been brought on to work with some of our clients.
That's right. It's not uncommon for consultancies such as ourselves, who are not CPAs, to work with CPA firms. We have a number that we partner with exclusively to do the advisory work and help build out the programs, because the CPA firms that are performing the audits per the CPA are prohibited from doing so. So yes, they can absolutely tell you if you're on track or not, but they can't guide you in how to remediate things or how to implement things. And so that's where services like Anitian's Vision Path come in.
The next challenge we've come across while working with some of our clients is the mapping of your control activities and test activities to the criteria. So first thing is, test activity just means the evidence, right? The proof that this control activity works, right? Best practice is you want to produce those evidence yourself first and make sure you can produce those evidence before bringing in an auditor for the official audit. So when I started one of our clients, the first thing we've noticed is there were a lot of copying and pasting of control activities and test activities to a criteria. And it was time consuming and tedious. The reason for that is you're going to come across situations where you're going to have what's called a many-to-many relationship, where you can apply a control to multiple criteria or a few TAs to other controls. And when it comes time to rewrite a control or produce a test activities, and now you have to update it, doing that manually through, copy and paste, it's going to take a lot of time, and it opens you up to errors, right? Because you don't want to send the auditor something which you've updated, say, a few weeks ago, and now they have a bad copy. The way we got around that is we just simply use a database. Microsoft Access works great. It's very simple, efficient. Everyone has it. And so what we did, we just create a table, right? You have your criteria table, control table, and test tables, and you just simply map them to each other. And when it comes time to updating a control activity or test activities, it's already mapped and it's already ready to go. Another benefit too is the ease of reporting and search. There may be situations where a stakeholder or a department lead wants a copy of the control activities or test activities they're responsible for. And you can just query and, only send them the controls that they need and not the other departments. So then again, like I said, ease of reporting, searching, and it also speeds up the time, right? We're no longer copying and pasting. This challenge, I feel is just very common, even outside of SOC 2. And that's just the lack of documentation evidence with any compliance. First off, if you can, use templates as much as possible. And once you have those templates, tailor those templates to fit your business and your organization, and also standardize those documents. And the reason for that is you want to show the auditors that you're prepared. And one way to do that is to provide documentation that are clean and consistent, right? Another reason is, hey, these documents are going out to your company internally, and they must follow that to demonstrate operational effectiveness. So that's my first recommendation. Don't retype anything when you shouldn't. The second one, again, going back to compliance, it just seems that whenever a compliance or audit thing comes up, we're scrambling to find evidence. And if you don't have an internal audit team, maybe create one ad hoc. That way it can assist you in scheduling and collecting these evidence during your SOC 2 program development. Third one is have some sort of dashboard. You want to know where you're at in your SOC 2 program and if you're ahead or falling behind. It's just not good to tell a stakeholder you're ready and when it turns out you're not. And the last one, which is it's been a success with one of our clients, is if possible, automate your evidence. Whether that's a workflow software you buy or use internally, or even something as simple as a reminder in Outlook. And the reason for that is, let's say, for example, if you have a control that says, we conduct vulnerability scans every month, right? Well, then as part of your test activities, you should have a vulnerability scan report for each month as according to that control. So that helps a lot if you can automate it, and then gives you a reminder. But also, have it in a central repository. SharePoint is great. It works well. And again, it goes back to the more prepared you are when it comes to audit time, the more likely for your success. And the last challenge is, especially during a long-term engagement, is just losing sight on the importance of the SOC 2 program. again, you don't want to be in a situation where you have your stakeholders bought off and sign off on the program. Money, budget, resources has been allocated to the program. And then along the way, you're getting questions like, well, we're still doing this, or I thought we were done with this, right? And the reason for that is you don't want to start something and then get into a situation where you're losing support or losing sight of it. A few things we've implemented with one of our clients is, one, have a communication plan. Monthly briefings to stakeholders, maybe weekly briefing to your department leads. Whatever is needed to communicate that, hey, we're still doing this program and it's still a priority. Also, have a project or implementation plan. This ties back to that dashboard. You can't, you need to measure where you're at in the program, and you need to measure if you're ahead or behind, or if other things come up, right, like a conference or something. The third one, which has also been successful, is if, outside of your executives and your department leads, have some sort of lunch and learn or brown bag sessions with the users, right? Something very informal, something that, addresses the fact that, hey, this is important to the company, to the program, and you guys are all key players in the success of the SOC 2 program. And lastly, which sometimes can be a challenge too, is establish some sort of scheduled meetings, again, with the stakeholders and department leads. Reason for that, like I said, if you're in a long-term engagement, and there's going to be times where, because of a conference or a change in leadership, resources change and priorities change. And as part of your program, you need to know that. You need to know that if there's a task assigned to a department lead to, implement a control, and now that person is no longer doing it, you need to know why, right? And how does that affect your program as a whole? So those are my takeaways for this challenge. So next two slides, it's really about the difference between the 2016 TSP and the 2017, it's called TSC, Trusted Service Category. Like I mentioned before, within the security principles are your common criteria. And if you had the time and the resources to do these common criteria in order, this is what we would suggest, right? Common criteria one is your higher level organization and management. Those are the criteria where you will see things like, does the entity demonstrate values and integrity? Does the entity have job description or org charts? Does the leadership communicate the importance of security? So you want to focus on that first. The next point there, because SOC 2 is essentially a risk type compliance, you want to focus on that. And also, historically, when we're working with our auditors, risk management seems to be very consistent. If an organization happens to fail or are not compliant with SOC 2 report, it usually comes down to risk management or change management. Those are the two main ones historically that organizations tend to fall short on. And then moving on, you have your logical physical access systems, change management, and so on. So like I said, the common criteria, they're numbered just really for tracking purpose, but like we recommend, if you do have time and have a choice, this would be the approach we'd recommend in addressing these common criteria.
So, the thing here, just to clarify, is that the reason we have these out of order is this is just based on priority. And we talked a little bit earlier regarding terminology, TSPs, trust service principles. The way to think of those is really as control families. But as you can see here, there's actually effectively 3 tiers within SOC 2. So you've got the TSPs, which are these high-level trust service principles, security being the core one. And then under there are these numbered top-level criteria, which are organized by category, if you will. So the first one there being the structural foundation of your security program, and so on down to risk management, and et cetera. And then underneath each of those common criteria are the actual specific criteria. So under CC1, there's a number of specific criteria, which are effectively the requirements for which you must define what your control implementation will be of those criteria. And then you will define what your TAs or test activities are to validate the effectiveness of the control implementation. And so, so that's just a little bit of clarification on kind of how these terminology and SOC 2 parlance works and fits together, and kind of aligns more commonly with other security frameworks that folks might be more familiar with.
All right, so that's the 2016 TSP, Trusted Service Principle. This next one, very similar to the 2016 TSP. This is the 2017 TSC, Trusted Service Categories. You may sometimes hear it as Trusted Service Principle and Category. And the reason for that is with the 2017 Trusted Service Category, AICPA wanted this to align with the COSO principles. So my guess is, in their eyes, they didn't want to say we have our Trusted Service Principles to align with the COSO principles. That's just my guess, right? But the approach here is very similar to 2016 TSP. One of the big takeaways, as you'll notice, is with this one, there's 9 common criteria versus 7 in the 2016 criteria, or common criteria. So essentially what they did here is they just split risk assessment into 2, risk assessment and risk mitigation. And they split up, I think, number 4 and 5, monitoring and controlling activities. So those 2 are split. Again, it's really to align with the COSO principles and to really give them a better alignment. But essentially, it's the same recommended approach as the 2016 TSP.
Yeah, it's really more terminology and some structural changes in the new version, and that's what we're talking about here between the 2016 and 2017. Effectively, it's just a new version with some terminology changes and some structural changes to the order of how the criteria are grouped. But the actual criteria themselves are not significantly changed. And we're talking about them because there's some overlap that you can be operating an audit against your choice for some period of time before 2016 is sunsetted.
Yes, exactly. So just for the audience, if you do plan to pursue a SOC 2 compliance report this year, you have that option. So as it calls out in the AICPA manual, between April and I think October of this year, you need to explicitly call out which criteria 2016 or 2017 you're pursuing. And that's as of this year. After this year, in the 2019, that's it. It's all 2017. So this is the final year that you have the option of pursuing either or.
But again, if you already have a program in place aligned with the 2016, migrating to 2017 should not be a hugely significant impact, especially if you have a COSO program in place.
Okay. In summary, folks, again, this is just a basic overview on the SOC 2 program. We went over, determining the service offering and why that's really key before you pursue your SOC 2 program. Selecting the appropriate TSP. Again, 2 takeaways from this. 1, you don't have to pursue all 5 right off the bat. Just pursue the ones that align to your service offerings or your customer base, like Adam mentioned. And the second takeaway with that is there may be criteria within that trusted serve principle that may not even apply to your service offering. So just keep that in mind. Challenges. Those are the 4 main ones that we've come across with some of our clients. Takeaway from that is automate as much as you can. The SOC 2 compliance audit, it's not a one and done type deal. It's a year-over-year compliance. And it's just a lot easier that if you have some sort of workflow or something automated that says, hey, generate this evidence on a monthly, quarterly, or annual basis as defined by your controls, it just makes it a lot easier coming audit time. And it just shows that you're prepared and you're ready to go. Recommended approach, like I said, first 2 is just get buy-in from the top and focus heavily on your risk management initially. That's all I have. I think we have time for questions, right, Adam?
Yeah, that's right. So we have one here for you, Hong. It's a little bit on the kind of foundational side, but since we have some time, someone said you mentioned earlier a type 1 and type 2 audit. Can you explain the difference there between those?
Yes. So essentially, type 1, just look at what's called your suitability of design. Do you have all your controls in place to meet that criteria? In most cases, those are just your policies, documentation procedures, saying that, hey, this is how we approach our criteria, right? And again, here, we mentioned earlier about working with the auditors. This is where you have an opportunity to say, hey, this is what we're going to have in place for type 1. And that's what the auditor is going to look for as they audit you specifically for a type 1 audit. Is everything in place? Is it designed to meet those controls? And are the auditors, when they're, in most cases, they may ask for 1 or 2 tests just to have assurance that those controls are actually working, right? The type 2 is what's called operational effectiveness, right? And that measures your tests or your evidence over time. So ideally, you'd want to type 1 first. You have that date, and your type 2 is, say, another date. Operational effectiveness is between type 1 and type 2. And what normally happens is an auditor will come in, or a practitioner, and they might say, they will pull what's called a population of a test sample, and they're just going to randomly pick a few. So for example, if you say, as part of your controls, you say, hey, every month we do this to meet change management, right? And 6 months has gone by, and now you want to do a type 2. Well, the auditor will take all 6 months of evidence, and they may randomly pick 3 as a sample. So that's what they mean by operational effectiveness. Are you doing what you say you're doing over a period of time? Let me see.
The way I always think about it is, for the type 1, they're basically coming in and auditing that your program meets the criteria, that what you've defined for your controls is appropriate. Then you execute that program for some period of time. That's when they come back to the type 2 and then audit that you actually have been following the program that they already validated for the type 1. So type 1 is the baseline. Yes, everything is defined appropriately. Now go ahead and run this program for some period of time, which is actually defined in the report. And then we will come back and audit the evidence that you were actually following all of your procedures appropriately. So the test activities that we talked about, and then that will be documented and say, okay, so you have a type 2 report that says for this period of time, we were assessed as following all the criteria that, as implemented in our controls.
Yeah. Here's another question. Let me see. Do I need a type 1 before a type 2? Technically, no. There's nothing in the AICPA manual that says you have to have a type 1. It is advised, however, that you should pursue a type 1, especially if it's your first run at it. But again, work with your auditors. Historically, they'll tell you it's 50-50, right? Depending on your organization, your service offering. If your scope are complex, like if you're working across multiple departments, across multiple locations, we'd strongly advise to do a type 1 first, because that reduces your risk, right? If you're jumping into a type 2 right off the bat, and again, type 2 measures your operational effectiveness, and it turns out you're missing a few controls here and there, or you're missing a few tests here and there, well, you just added to your risk of not passing a SOC 2 audit. So the short answer is, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So yeah, short answer is that you really should get to type 1 first. And really the risk there, to underscore what Hong was saying, if you don't get that baseline audit for the type 1, remember for the type 2, you have to be operating your program over a defined time period. The first year, it's usually 6 months. It could be, you have to work with your CPA firm and understand your customers' expectations. It could be less, but the generally accepted period is a 6-month window. And then subsequent years, it's usually an annualized basis. Now, if you skip the type 1 and go right to the type 2, and you've been operating your program for 6 months, and the auditors come in and say, hey, sorry, your control implementations are not appropriate, even though you were doing what you said you'd be doing, but what you said you'd be doing is not what you need to be doing effectively, then you've got to rejigger your controls and then execute them for another period of time, upwards of 6 months. And so the underlying driver for SOC 2 compliance in almost all cases is business competitiveness, right? It's a business requirement in order to your customers say, we're not going to use your service. Remember, it's for service providers, and that term is used very generically. But nevertheless, it's for service providers, and so their customers are saying, you need to be SOC 2 compliant before we're going to pay you to use your service. And so that's where the pressure comes from the business on the InfoSec team, the GRC team, and all of the supporting stakeholders, of course, to implement the program and operate it effectively and pass the audit. And so if you skip the type 1 and you go straight into type 2 over 6 months, and they come in and say, sorry, what you defined was not correct, you have to redefine it and then run for another 6 months, you're pushing out your audit compliance timeline pretty significantly. But if they come into the type 1 and say, okay, what you've defined is not appropriate, you can rejigger that and they can come right back. And it's a much quicker turnaround, and then execute your type 2 without having had to run something for a period of time incorrectly. So, obviously it depends on the organization's risk tolerance, but we really strongly advise against skipping the type 1 and going right to the type 2.
Okay. Next question. Can you speak to the challenge of setting expectations with new control owners? Specifically the scope of their job. So from my experience, and Adam, maybe you have something different, the challenge really is about education. Initially, when you're coming to a control owner, potential control, and saying, hey, this is a requirement, you kind of need to do this now, you normally get a why. I normally get a why we got to do this. So it comes back to education, like I said. Lunch and learn helps. Brown bag session helps. And it's really, explain to them that, hey, you have a key piece in this program, and the scope of your job is not going to change drastically, if I'm understanding the question right. But something we may need to add on as part of your day-to-day operations. Ensuring evidence is collected, like I said, automation, that's what helped us, or also having an internal audit team or practice team to, again, just assist in educating the users or the new control owners the importance of their piece in the bigger SOC 2 effort.
So, we talked about operational effectiveness. I can't underscore enough how much we believe as security practitioners, not just auditors or compliance folks, that the real value of a compliance program to the organization is to mitigate business risk. Sure, you need to get your SOC 2 Type 2 report so you can close that big deal and bring in revenue, right? Which, of course, is the lifeblood of every business. But you need to keep those customers. And you do that by maintaining their trust and assurance. And anyone who's ever gone through any type of audit or compliance program or even internal governance program understands that you can certainly be technically compliant with some controls and not necessarily have reduced risk as much as might be optimal. And so we strongly advocated a nation to use the effectively business pressure that the organization has for compliance as an opportunity to reduce risk. And so by focusing on the operational effectiveness of the implementation of the controls, in our experience, particularly with IT folks, we're not the only stakeholders in this, of course, but there are plenty of technical controls. You're going to get more buy-in if they can see and you socialize appropriately the value of why you're doing these controls, not just from a check the box and pass the audit, which they probably don't necessarily care about. Of course, they care about the business and the health of the business and why you're doing it in the first place to some degree. But the reality is, if they see these controls as just a bunch of paperwork and burden to them for some audit that they don't even know about or understand, you're not going to get the buy-in. But if you explain to them the why for the controls and how that actually is mitigating risk in their domain, that ultimately will give them that ability to sleep a little easier at night, that in our opinion really helps and get the buy-in there. And then the other thing, this is a big initiative that Anitian has been working on the past year with many of our partners, most notably Amazon Web Services. If you follow our material, I'm sure you've seen some blogs and webinars around this, is security automation and orchestration is really the linchpin of mitigating the pain of compliance. The reality is, even really well-run security programs and departments, forget about compliance, the more manual it has to be, even if everyone buys in and everyone's trying to do the right thing, the more there are manual human dependencies on control, maintenance, implementation, and operation, the more likely they are to fail. And so the more you can automate control implementation, operation, and validation, the easier and more effective this is for everybody. And of course, just the huge change in technology landscape over the last several years, with everything having an API and everything going to the cloud, really facilitates that compliance as code approach and really helps get buy-in from the stakeholders, because you're asking them less of them than you would have 10 years ago if you can be automating the control implementation or working with them to design an automation that can implement, operate, and most critically, validate. And by validate, I mean some type of audit evidence generation in an automated fashion. So let's see here. We have time for probably one more question.
Okay. I'll take the next one then. Once a company has the SOC 2, once a company has a SOC 2 Type 2, how often do they need to renew? And what is the typical cost? So like I said, it's an annual renewal, but it's not, when I say annual, it's not exactly 12 months, right? You just have to work with your auditors and they'll tell you there's some leeway. But yes, it's an annual requirement, give or take a few months. What is the typical audit cost? that varies. Like I said, the SOC 2, you're being audited by a CPA firm, right? And whether that's your Big Four, Moss Adams, or whoever, those costs vary. So we cannot give you like a specific cost on that. But the takeaway is 12 months, and give or take a few months.
Okay. So that covers the questions that we had here today. We're going to make this webinar available on our website within the next couple days. If anyone has any other questions, you're obviously welcome to reach out to us through our website. It has a contact us button. We also, on our website, is a link to the Anitian blog, where Hong has an excellent overview of the SOC 2 basics. And I know he has another one in the works as well that will be expanding on that content and the content we discussed here today. You could also look at some of our resources on security automation and compliance as code. So with that, we'd like to thank everybody for attending, and we'll give you a few minutes back of your hour, and look forward to you joining us in our next webinar.